Next up, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Denny. Dr. John Denny joined the Strategic Studies Institute, U.S. Army War College, in November of 2011 as a research professor of Joint Interagency, Intergovernmental, and Multinational Security Studies. Mouthful. Thanks, John. Appreciate it. He previously worked for 10 years as a political advisor and strategic planner for senior U.S. military commanders in Europe, and also taught graduate and undergraduate courses on U.S. and NATO foreign and security policy at Heidelberg's University Institute for Political Science. Previously, Dr. Denny spent 7 years in Washington, D.C. as a consultant specializing in national security issues for the U.S. Department of Defense, Energy, and State. He has spoken at international conferences and symposia and is the author of the book, Alliance Management and Maintenance, Restructuring NATO for the 21st Century, as well as several monographs, journal articles, and op-eds. He completed his undergraduate degree in History and International Relations at the College of William and Mary. He holds a Master of Arts in U.S. Foreign Policy from the American University in Washington, D.C., and a Ph.D. in International Affairs from George Washington University. And he's here to answer, can operational energy overcome history? Dr. Denny.
Good morning, or I should, good afternoon, by about 2 minutes. My name is John Denny. I'm from the Strategic Studies Institute at the Army War College. We're sort of the research arm of the War College up in Carlisle. I want to thank Troy for that introduction, and also the acting ASD, Morehouse, and his team for inviting me down here to talk to you today. I find myself in kind of an awkward position because I'm going to be delivering what might be perceived as kind of a pessimistic message. And that is not the way I view this particular issue, but the evidence has led me to the conclusions that I'll shortly explain to you. Since I am an employee of the War College, I am a government employee. However, the views I express today are my own and do not reflect the U.S. Army, DOD, or the U.S. government. So with that, next slide, please. Outside of this building, and maybe even outside of OEPP, the conventional wisdom is that DOD is relatively a newcomer to this issue of operational energy security. But in fact, the department's been dealing with operational energy security since at least the 1940s, and possibly as early as 1912, when President Taft, pictured here in glorious furs and whatnot, designated the Elk Hills region of California as the nation's first petroleum reserve. Now, during World War II, the U.S. provided fighting against the Axis powers. As the war intensified in 1942, officials in Washington feared that American supplies might actually run out. Next slide, please. As a result of that, the U.S. began to cultivate a special relationship with Saudi Arabia, promoted the development of domestic synthetic fuels, built massive underground fuel storage facilities, next slide please, like the one depicted here at Red Hill in Hawaii, and constructed critical fuel pipelines both domestically and overseas. Next slide. By the early to mid-1950s, though, petroleum had become abundant and cheap. Next slide. As a result of major oil discoveries in the Middle East. As a result, in 1953, Congress terminated funding for the synthetic fuels program and closed related production plants. This and other evidence indicates that by the mid to late 50s and then throughout the 1960s, energy security and its subset of operational energy security became less of a major concern for Washington and for the Pentagon. Next slide. Now, with the oil shocks of the 70s, however, operational energy security received renewed attention in the U.S. For instance, DOD established its first ever energy efficiency standards, and the Army created its first ever energy office. In 1980, President Carter and the Congress created a government-backed corporation to develop synthetic fuels, and all of the military services experimented with the use of shale-based fuels. Now, much of this progress was soon undone, though. Starting in the 80s and then continuing through the 90s, next slide, cheap fuel caused by a petroleum production glut again caused the U.S. to largely lose the sense of urgency regarding its energy security. Within DOD, practically all mobility systems, major mobility systems, so think tanks, jets, ships, that were then under development in the 80s were all intended to rely upon petroleum-based fuels. Moreover, available evidence from across a wide swath of the department's regulatory and institutional landscape indicates there was no significant emphasis on operational energy security in the 80s or the 90s. Although it was obvious to some at the time that DOD could increase warfighting capability, reduce the logistical burden, and cut overall costs by making weapon systems more efficient, such benefits were not valued in the department in terms of its acquisition process. And similarly, DoD resource allocation and accounting procedures did not penalize inefficiency or reward efficiency. Simply was not a concern at the time. Now let's contrast that period to the 2000s. Next slide, please. And the return of operational energy security as a critical area of interest for the U.S., and especially within DoD. As was the case in the 70s and the 40s, America's interest in operational, next slide, please, operational energy security has been driven primarily by major changes in the international energy system. And I'm only going to mention two of them, but there's perhaps a third one. The first is oil demand increased significantly, especially in developing countries like China and India. And you've got an image here that shows you that in China. Next slide. This shows the same for India. Not as dramatic, but you get the idea. Production decreased, the second factor, production decreased in some of the world's major producing countries, largely as a result of domestic or geopolitical conflict. Next slide. This shows the situation in Mexico. Next. Venezuela. Next. Iraq, obviously. And then finally, next slide, Nigeria. So you can imagine what's going on here, right? Demand is increasing pretty dramatically, especially because of developing countries, and supply is decreasing. Obviously, anybody who studied Economics 101, that's going to create a price problem. Next slide. Third factor that I won't go into detail here is this increasing understanding of the nexus between climate change and the burning of fossil fuels. But we can come back to that in Q&A. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead. Next slide, please. Now, these recent changes I've outlined for you in the energy system have been compounded by certain aspects of ongoing military operations. So, for example, conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have been characterized by this hybrid nature, right, where the enemy focuses on fighting an asymmetric kind of fight, where there's no front in the traditional sense. Areas that we thought of as typically in the rear, that were safe, are now subject to attack. This creates a real problem for getting fuel from the point of procurement to the point of operational use. Now, all of these factors that we've seen play out over the last decade plus have compelled DoD to refocus once again on operational energy security. Next slide. So, for example, we've seen the creation of this new position of ASD for operational energy security in 2010. Next slide. Next. We had the development of an operational energy strategy in 2011, next. Then an operational energy strategy implementation plan in 2012. And finally, next, in April 2014, the department released an energy policy for the first time in over 2 decades. Now, additionally, DoD has begun a major benchmarking effort to try to measure where we are or assess where we are and then measure progress moving forward. Next, please. In a variety of energy-related initiatives. At the same time, DoD is working more closely than ever with interagency partners, such as the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture. So in short, these initiatives, things going on institutionally within the department in terms of its organizational structure, the amount of resources devoted, it's obvious that DoD is refocused, or maybe we could say refocused, on energy security once again. But as I mentioned, we've been down this path before, right? We did this in the 70s and the 40s. Why hasn't our focus on energy security stuck? In part, production gluts based upon technological advances explain a lot of this, as we saw in the 50s and in the 80s. Energy becomes cheap, and frankly, Americans stop caring about it so much. So the real question is, why do we stop caring so much? And there, I think we have to look at this cultural variable as a key explanatory factor. Americans use energy in a very particular way, which is different, for example, from how our partners in Europe might use it. To those that have lived in the US and Western Europe, these differences are obvious, right? When you're in Europe, there are motion sensor light switches everywhere. You can hardly buy an incandescent light bulb anywhere in Europe now. They're illegal to produce any further. To do a load of wash, for example, it takes twice as long, right? Thanks to smaller, more energy efficient washers and dryers. But it's more than just the anecdotal, that back up this sense that we use energy differently than many other countries of the world, developed countries of the world. Next slide, please. This slide depicts per capita energy use going back to 1980. The blue line is the US and the red line is Europe, or the EU. And you can see that even through peaks and troughs in the business cycle, through gluts in energy, in petroleum production, we have used a dramatically higher amount per capita of energy than our European friends. Energy use is based on more than just technological achievements or economic growth. Culture plays an important role as well, shaping the way in which people live their lives and how they think about and use energy. Now, constructivist scholars in the field of political science have long tapped into culture as an explanatory variable. Sometimes it can be a bit nebulous. It's a bit difficult to pin down. But let me give you this as sort of an example. The average European consumer of energy has, over the last couple of generations, perceived energy as rare, expensive, and occasionally scarce. Therefore, that results in a sense of limitations in terms of how Europeans think about energy. Now, in contrast, in the US, we've typically, the last couple of generations, thought about energy as sometimes scarce, but not usually. Usually cheap is the norm and plentiful. So that shapes the manner in which we think about it and how we use it. Now, the episodic nature of America's interest in energy security, of course, begs the question of whether some future change in terms of technology, in the international energy system, or perhaps the end of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, might once again compel us to lose focus. Next slide, please. Indeed, the unfolding shale revolution, tight oil revolution, that's occurring now across North America may represent that technological breakthrough, just as the U.S. winds down its two wars. Now, DoD seems fully aware of these challenges. As a result, the department is striving to inculcate a greater energy security culture within the military. And to that end, each of the services have begun a cultural awareness or cultural change efforts. Nonetheless, it remains to be seen whether DoD and the U.S. whether these efforts will endure beyond what might have been just a temporary period of energy insecurity over the last 10 to 12 years. Given America's historically episodic focus on energy security, the long-term outlook for operational energy security appears to me to be limited. Nonetheless, there are steps that DoD can take to try to overcome these short-term challenges and cement the gains made today. In the interest of time, though, I'm going to save those recommendations for the Q&A if you'd like to get into them. For now, thanks for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.